0.4% the previous quarter. President Trump's spiritual advisor, Professor Mark Burns, has told LBC they knew this would happen.
President Trump warned the American population that, yes, it's going to be hard for a little while, but that's just a little while. It's not going to be that way forever because these deals are going to get done. Literally every country in the world wants to do business with the United States of America.
The Chancellor is being investigated by Parliament's Standards Commissioner over her entries in the Commons Register of Interests. Rachel Reeves' spokesperson says it's over a late entry. A police officer cleared of the murder of Chris Cabba will now face gross misconduct proceedings. Sergeant Martin Blake shot the 24-year-old in Streatham in South London in September 2022. And the King has thanked the people who helped those who receive a cancer diagnosis during a reception at Buckingham Palace. The monarch, who has the disease himself, is hosting a number of organisations and individuals who offer support. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed up 31 points at 84.94. The pound buys $1.33 and €1.17. LBC weather: a mild night with clear skies for most. Showers drifting in from the northwest in Scotland and Northern Ireland. These will become widespread in the early hours, a low of 3 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Amelia Cox.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. It's 6 p.m. Now, Tonight with Andrew Marr.
Good evening. Tony Blair is rarely confused. Certainly what he said yesterday about net zero didn't seem confused. I'm going to remind you of it. Present policy solutions are inadequate and, worse, are distorting the debate into a quest for a climate platform that is unrealistic and therefore unworkable. Too often, political leaders fear saying what many know to be true: the current approach isn't working. Political leaders knew, he said, the debate had become irrational, but were terrified of saying so in case they were accused of being climate deniers. And Sir Tony went on to warn any strategy based on either phasing out fossil fuels in the short term or limiting consumption is a strategy doomed to fail. Now, this strikes me as an important point. In essence, haranguing ordinary, hard-pressed members of the public or making their lives harder just hacks them off. Ordering voters to stop flying or suddenly garage their cars or pay higher fuel bills, well, that is not how you win arguments. But the Blair message sounded very like a full-scale attack on the government's net zero strategy, an attack coming at exactly the wrong moment and one which must have infuriated the Prime Minister. The Unite Union jumped in today saying that workers' resentment at the government's net zero plan failing to deliver good jobs was growing and calling for a fundamental rethink. Its General Secretary, Sharon Graham, said working class people were losing their jobs and the government has absolutely no plan to replace them. Well, today, Blair reversed direction and said the government's approach was the right one. Politics, politics. And at this point, you might think, give it a rest. But we can't. The threat of climate change is real and imminent and cannot be shrugged off. Today, the Independent Climate Change Committee says Britain's actually made too little progress in confronting the threats ahead to hospitals and care homes and food and water supplies. So are we doing too much or too little, or somehow too much and too little at the same time? Let's start today with one of the cabinet ministers involved in all of this, the Transport Secretary, Heidi Alexander. Did she agree with Sir Tony Blair's comments?
So I think that headline has probably come about as a result of a partial reading of the report.
I've read the whole thing.
I do know that one of his spokespersons today has said that actually he believes that the UK government approach to the transition to net zero is entirely the right one, Andrew.
We both know what's happened, which is that the Prime Minister phoned him up and said, Tony, this is really, really unhelpful. Would you please reverse ferret? And he has duly reversed ferret. But his original words are pretty stinging and pretty detailed and pretty clear that the way you are approaching the climate change crisis is not working.
No, I think what Tony was saying is that you need to apply pragmatism and logic to the transition to net zero. And that is exactly what this government is doing. One of the things that Tony said is that we should be investing in things like carbon capture and storage. We've, of course, invested more than £20 billion in that. It's entirely right. And he would agree with this, that we maintain our commitment to net zero by 2050. I also saw him pointing out that what we need is a phased and responsible transition to net zero. We're not going to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels overnight. We've always been honest about that as a government. And if you look at some of the decisions that I have taken in my role as Transport Secretary, with things like the flexibilities that we've introduced to the zero emission vehicle mandate, the fact that we've said that plug-in hybrids, other hybrid cars can be sold through to 2035. I think that is about meeting people where they are whilst not reducing our ambition to get to 2050.
Not being too doctrinal, as it were. Can I read to you what Sharon Graham of the Unite Union has said? Not one of Tony Blair's natural and endless supporters, it has to be said. She says workers' resentment grows as government net zero plan fails to deliver good jobs. And she said that Tony Blair is right to say it's doomed to fail. And thinking particularly about Grangemouth, she says, the fact is working class people are losing their jobs and this government has absolutely no plan to replace them. And she says it's time for a rethink on net zero.
Well, I don't agree with that statement, because I think that the jobs of the future are going to be in green industries. And you referred to Grangemouth. We've got Project Willow there. We are committed to securing well-paid, high-quality jobs for the long term at Grangemouth. There is a global race on, and we should be a country that is aspiring to win that race. And I think that the transition to net zero, if done in the correct way, can unlock really good jobs across the country. If you think about the need for fitters to be fitting solar panels, if you think about the opportunity in things like sustainable aviation fuel, that's something that I'm doing a lot of work on in the Department for Transport to try and clean up aviation, because Tony Blair is also right to say that things like demand for air travel is going up, and we need to live in the real world. If we're going to have more people flying, we need to make aviation greener.
Absolutely.
And so that's why we need to be cleaning up the fuel that jet engines are using.
Absolutely right. But as you know, the original plan for Grangemouth could have made that a leader in the production of green aviation fuel. That's what it could have done. But instead, it's simply going to import fuel with a loss of huge numbers of jobs. That doesn't seem to, and many people like, a really robust industrial strategy.
So with respect
we can do it ourselves.
With respect to sustainable aviation fuel, we have one plant at the moment at Immingham on Teesside, which commercially produces sustainable aviation fuel, a company called Phillips 66. This year, we introduced the Sustainable Aviation Fuels Mandate, which is a requirement on the jet fuel suppliers about the amount of sustainable fuel they have in the mix in the jet engines in aircrafts. That will ratchet up over time. We also committed in the King's Speech to introduce a revenue certainty mechanism so that investors who are now looking today at investing in sustainable aviation fuel in the future can have some guarantees about the price that they will get, because we do recognise that there is significant investment that is needed in these plants, but this is the future, and that is the way we're going to be greening aviation as well as
Why couldn't we have done it at Grangemouth for ourselves?
So there's still a lot of discussions that are ongoing about Grangemouth.
So you think that story's not over?
Grangemouth, and we're working very hard across government, both with Ed Miliband, the Energy Secretary, and with Jonathan Reynolds, and the Project Willow work that we're doing is really important.
Taking it in the round and reading it carefully and looking at all the caveats, do you think the argument that Tony Blair made about net zero is helpful or right or what?
I think he's right to say that we need to meet people where they are at, but we also have to maintain our ambition of getting to net zero and our commitment, our legally binding commitment to get to net zero by 2050. If we think about aviation, I don't have children, Andrew, but I do have nieces and nephews, and I want them to be able to fly and travel to the parts of the world that I've had the opportunity to. I think that's a good thing for individuals to be able to experience different cultures, and we've all got businesses in our constituencies that trade internationally, families that span the globe. Of course, there is going to be a demand for air travel, but we have a moral responsibility to run as fast as we can at greening aviation.
Yes,
because I don't want my niece and nephew to be waking up in a world that is ravaged by more extreme weather events. And so I don't think we should accept this false trade-off between growing the economy on the one hand and doing what's right for the environment. I think we can do both at the same time.
Now, you rightly raise extreme weather events and the possibilities of drought, really, really hot weather, which can kill particularly older people, and on the other side of the thing, floods and flooding, particularly on agricultural land, is really imminent now. The Climate Change Commissioner said today that we are nothing like prepared or resilient enough in this country. What do you think?
So this government is investing £2.3 billion in flood defences and flood resilience. As a local MP, just last Friday, I was chairing a meeting. It was actually a street corner meeting with the Environment Agency, with Thames Water, with the lead local flood authority, which is the local council, to make sure that we are joined up in our response to this challenge as well. And I think that was one of the commitments that the Labour Party made going into the general election, that we would have more coordination, because we can't get to the same point every year where we're looking at heavy rain starting and people living in their homes or running their businesses worried about the fact that they're going to be flooded, or worse than that, that sewage is going to be bubbling up into their homes. And that's the situation that I am dealing with currently as a local member of Parliament. And I know that Steve Reid, the Environment Secretary, Emma Hardy, the Floods Minister, are totally focused on how we improve coordination to address some of these resilience problems. But you're right too that it is a problem across infrastructure more generally. And one of the principles that my department has been looking at through the spending review and the work that we're doing with Treasury on roads and on rail, how we can make sure that our investment plans
because they're both vulnerable.
are addressing resilience issues. And it's really important we get ahead of this, because otherwise it will have a negative effect on our ability to grow the economy.
Let me ask you about another imminent threat, which is the Co-op after Marks and Spencer's has been the victim of a cyber attack. How resilient do you think our transport system is to this kind of attack? I'm thinking also of what's happened in Spain and Portugal and the devastating effect on transport there.
So it was only a couple of months ago that Transport for London did have a serious cyber attack, and they worked very hard to contain that and to ensure that services were still able to run. So it is a real threat, and as a government and all transport operators need to take this very seriously, and we're taking it seriously across government as well. So Pat McFadden, as the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, and his responsibilities in pulling action together across government, has coordinated meetings in the last couple of months that I've been part of to make sure that we've got a proper cross-Whitehall approach to this.
Heidi Alexander, Secretary of State for Transport, thank you very much for coming in.
Thanks, Andrew.
Now, I mentioned earlier the Climate Change Committee, whose report today about Britain's lack of resilience is deeply worrying, and more worrying the closer you read it. The chair of the committee is Baroness Brown, and she joined me just a little earlier. I began by asking her, in this detailed report, what worried her most?
This has actually been our most detailed report ever, I think, on the state of the UK's preparedness for climate change. All credit to the team at the Climate Change who've done all the background work for it. And we haven't, in the area of progress in terms of action to address climate impacts, we haven't been able to assess any aspect of what the government or what's being done across sectors as good. That's really frightening, because climate change isn't tomorrow's problem. It's something we need to be prepared for today, as well as preparing for worse to come.
This year, next year, and the year after. I guess there's two things that people think about immediately. One is heat, longer, hotter, drier periods, and the other is very heavy rain. Let's start with heat. Is the main concern older and vulnerable people not being able to make it through a really hot spell?
I think that is a big concern, but I think beyond that, actually, there's a general concern about how effectively we work in hot weather. More and more of us work more from home, yet we know that many UK homes overheat in a summer already. So productivity, a problem for the UK economy, productivity will drop. But in terms of older people, in the summers of 2018 and 2022, two very hot summers, but those will be typical summers by 2050. We saw in England alone around 3,000 additional heat-related deaths. If we don't take more measures, we're predicting that number will rise to about 10,000.
So if I was the Prime Minister and I say, Lady Brown, explain to me what kind of measures I could take to mitigate that number of deaths, what would you say to me?
Well, we think that the government needs a heat-resilient strategy because
that sort of cool areas, buildings that are cool. It
could indeed be cool places that people can go, which some American cities have introduced. But it's also about informing the public about what to do when the weather is hot. If you live in the south of France, you know that you have a house or a flat with shutters. During the day, you shut the shutters or you shut the curtains, you keep the hot air out, and at night, you let the cooler air in. That isn't second nature to us in the UK. People need to know what it is they can do without spending any money. They need to know that if they have elderly relatives or neighbours, they need to check on them to make sure they're drinking enough water, things like that. But we also, we have a mission, the government has a mission to build 1.5 million new homes. We need to make sure those new homes are going to be nice places to live.
In very hot weather.
In very hot
and
weather.
Of course,
and resilient to flooding, and actually using less water so that we're not exacerbating drought.
Well, you mentioned water and you mentioned drought, because the other thing that comes with very hot weather, of course, can be very long periods of very low rainfall or drought. That has a big effect on what we can grow in this country, on farming, but also, I guess, on fires and wildfires.
It does, and last week, we had a report from the National Audit Office highlighting the 50 billion litres per day shortfall in water availability by 2050 if more action isn't taken to stop leaks and to reduce consumption and to build more reservoirs. And they said that the regulators didn't seem to understand the problem. I mean,
that is terrifying. That is terrifying.
On wildfires, we had the news last weekend that the first 3 months of this year, we have had more area burnt in the UK than has ever been recorded in a year. Now, records only start in 2012, but that's in the first 3 months, and it hasn't felt particularly dry.
We've mentioned extreme heat and we've mentioned drought. Let's turn to the other side, which is flood.
Well, flooding, again, last year we had the new flood projections from the Environment Agency. They show that today more than 50% of our Grade 1 agricultural land is at risk of flooding. And that increases more agricultural. That
is what we call East Anglia in common parlance.
Absolutely, East Anglia, and that's some of our really our best agricultural land where a lot of our vegetables are grown as well.
So, are we talking about a new system of dikes or pumping to mitigate that?
We're certainly talking about better drainage, but better drainage combined with, for example, on-farm water storage. But we might also be starting to think about, are we using the right land for the right things? Because, of course, some of that land is also some of our very best lowland peat, and we should be thinking about should we, in some areas, be trying to preserve that lowland peat.
And that gives resilience against flooding and indeed against drought as well, doesn't it?
It does indeed, but that needs to be done, obviously, in very close collaboration with farmers who need to understand, where their future income is going to, but it's coming from. But, of course, it's not just farmland. Today, a third of our railway kilometres and our road kilometres are at risk of flooding. If we don't take more action, rising to half by 2050. 6 million properties are at risk of flooding, rising to 8 million by 2050. 8 million is 1 in 4 properties in the UK at risk of flooding.
Very, very interesting. Final point, Tony Blair had a go really at the politics of climate change and net zero yesterday. And I think his underlying message was, you're not winning the public argument and you have to think about this differently. Do you have some sympathy with that?
Well, I think the public are worried about the changes in the climate, and I certainly think that's a way of talking to them about things. You know, we know they're worried about extreme weather. We know they're worried about what may happen to their elderly relatives or elderly or infirm relatives and friends in these sorts of conditions. We know they're worried about rising food prices, and rising food prices are being driven by climate change. I mean, we've just had Easter, and I've eaten far too much chocolate, and the Christian Aid produced a report showing that cocoa prices have gone up by 400% in the last 3 years because of climate change issues, too hot, lack of water. So, but that's not just chocolate, unfortunately. It's all sorts of other food is going up in price.
So really the message to the government is partly go back to the basics, talk about heat, talk about rain, talk about food prices.
Well, it's certainly something we would like them to be talking about.
All right, Baroness Brown, thank you very much indeed for coming in.
Thank you.
Baroness Brown of Cambridge. Now, coming up, King Charles has addressed guests at a cancer support reception today, and I'm going to be joined by the King's biographer next. Time now, 6:21.
This is LBC. Tonight with Andrew Marr. Watch live on Global Player. This is LBC.
6:22. So, as you have been hearing, King Charles has addressed guests at the cancer support reception in Buckingham Palace today. Let's find out a bit more of what he's been saying with his biographer, Robert Hardman. Robert, thank you very much indeed for joining us. It's a very moving address that he's made to this cancer reception, Robert, but he doesn't tell us very much, or indeed anything at all, really, about his own condition.
No, good evening, Andrew. No, it is certainly a sort of standout statement. He hasn't actually delivered it as a speech. He's given it as a sort of message to guests arriving at this cancer reception at the Palace tonight, about 400 people there. I mean, as you say, he doesn't give much away about his own diagnosis. That's been very much the case, really, since it started. Since it was first announced in February of last year, because he does have this feeling that, if I tell everybody precisely what sort of cancer I've got, everyone immediately sort of starts Googling that particular type of cancer, but also B, he sort of loses the sort of the broader reach that he has to the entire, if you like, cancer community. I mean, he's very keen that, what he says is understood and appreciated by not just everybody with every type of cancer, but their families too. And I don't think that's going to change. I don't think we can
absolutely
any change in his own condition, but I think it is very telling that it should come today, because today is the anniversary of the day when he went to the University College London Cancer Centre last year, and that was really his first sort of breakout from his sort of seclusion. I think broadly it has some very interesting lines in it.
It does. Well, let me give a few of them. He's talking to the more than 1,000 people who get a case of cancer diagnosed every day, and he says it's a daunting and frightening experience, perhaps reflecting on his own feelings. As one among those statistics myself, he says, I can vouch for the fact it can also be an experience that brings into sharp focus the very best of humanity. And I suppose no surprise here, Robert, a lot of this is addressed to all the people, nurses and doctors and others, fundraisers working in the cancer field.
Yes, I mean, it's right across the board, because let's remember, I mean, long, as you will know, Andrew, I mean, long before his diagnosis, for decades, really, he's had a close association with a number of cancer charities, some of them more on the sort of the caring, the Macmillan nurses, for example, that side of things. Some of them are very much dedicated to sort of fundraising for research. So he's very well versed in this. I mean, he as cancer sufferers go, I would say he's got a pretty extensive knowledge of aspect of this. So I mean, that tonight's guest list really is across the board. It goes from the sort of the absolute experts in right up there at the top of the medical field to volunteers, to fundraisers. It's very much look, I am king of all of you lot is the message. But I do think that, given that we have heard periodically these comments from him, but never a speech. He never sort of stands at a rostrum and talks about it.
Yes.
These usually delivered as either remarks on a walkabout or whatever, or in this case. Sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say, sorry, we haven't seen so much of him recently, Robert. What's your understanding of his general health at the moment?
Oh, I think I don't think it's changed. I think it's. I mean, gosh, compared to this time last year, it's so much better. We have seen a fair bit. We had that wobble a few weeks ago when he was about to go to Birmingham and he cancelled a day's engagements. But I mean, since then we've had a full state visit to Italy. Okay. And we've had all of the various Easter events, including the Maundy service in Durham. And next week is going to be one of those weeks when it's all hands to the Royal Pump for VE Day. You're going to see the whole lot on parade, but led by him. So I don't think anybody should be any more worried today than they were yesterday.
They were. Well, that's good. And he quotes the words of the late Dame Deborah James. And I think if you put these words into Latin somehow, they could be a personal motto for the king. Find a life worth enjoying, take risks, love deeply, have no regrets, and always, always have rebellious hope. Robert, thank you very much indeed. Now then, Chris Cabba was shot dead while driving his car unarmed in 2022. The police officer, Martin Blake, was cleared of murdering the 22-year-old, a violent member of a South London gang who he said he feared was going to use the car to ram fellow officers. At the time of the trial, it was widely feared that if Blake was found guilty, armed police officers would walk out en masse. But today, the armed officer learned that he will face a disciplinary hearing for gross misconduct, which could result in him being sacked from the force. Let's talk now to LBC's Fraser Knight, who's been covering the story. Fraser, great to have you in. This is going to cause a lot of distress or upset inside the police force, isn't it?
It already has, really. Look, Martin Blake went through a long period where the IOPC, the police watchdog, was deciding whether to take any action, and then the Crown Prosecution Service deciding whether or not to charge him. And then, of course, the trial itself, where he was ultimately cleared of the charge of murder. But since then, the IOPC has still been trying to decide whether or not he should face disciplinary action, a gross misconduct hearing. And today we learned that they have decided that should happen. And so even after all of that time since September 2022, when Chris Cabba was shot dead through the windscreen of the car that he was driving, Martin Blake will face a gross misconduct hearing, which could mean that he could lose his job, all because of professional standards. So this won't look at the criminality, which has already been determined. It never happened. He wasn't, a murderer. It will instead look at whether the professional standards and the training, the proportional force, has been followed. And if they find that it hasn't, then he could lose his job over this.
And I've seen the Police Federation saying this isn't right, this isn't just, it's disproportionate. And they said the IOPC isn't really worth worth anything.
They've been saying that for a while, as have a lot of police officers. You know, you speak to any police officers and they question whether the IOPC is set up in the right way. There's a lot of criticism about the length of time that these investigations take, and that's a message that has been echoed tonight on LBC by Tony Long, who of course was another Metropolitan Police officer who was taken through the courts 10 years after he had taken the fatal shot against Azelle Rodney, and also ultimately acquitted. This is what he said to Tom Swarbrick earlier.
The man's a hero. The man put his own life, and so, as did his colleagues, to stop a man who had been involved in armed criminality within just previous days of this, who's using 1.5 tons of steel to try and drive his way out of a police roadblock. If you play stupid games, you win stupid prizes. The only person responsible for Chris Cabba's death was Chris Cabba.
Now, of course, while there's been a lot of criticism from within police, there is a bit of hope coming from Chris Cabba's family. After the acquittal of Martin Blake, they said that they would continue to fight. They have said they welcome the IOPC's decision. And this is a reminder of what their spokesperson said outside court in October.
Despite this verdict, our commitment remains unwavering. For the Cabba family, justice was never about this verdict alone. They were clear from the beginning. This was always about more, about real systemic change that would have prevented Chris from being killed and that can prevent other people from being killed in this country by the police in the future.
Now, I have to say the Metropolitan Police did all they could to try and stop this from happening. They said they made strong representations, and they say they know another lengthy process will fall heavily on the shoulders of Martin Blake. And of course, questions about the IOPC, which we've spoken about. The Prime Minister's spokesperson has said they do have confidence in the police watchdog. They will allow this process to go through, but they've said the verdict of the jury, the acquittal of Martin Blake, should of course also be respected.
One of these stories everybody's got an opinion upon. Fraser Knight, thank you very much indeed. Coming up, ahead of the local elections, we're going to take a closer look at the prospects for Kemi Badenoch and the Conservative Party with a prominent Conservative peer. But the time now, 6:31, and Amelia Cox has your news headlines.
Donald Trump has urged Americans to be patient after the US economy shrank for the first time in 3 years. GDP fell by 0.3% in the first quarter of the year, compared to growth of 2.4% during the last 3 months of 2024. A court has been shown mobile phone footage of the moment the famous Sycamore Gap tree was cut down. 39-year-old Daniel Graham and Adam Carruthers, who's 32, both deny criminal damage. And the Transport Secretary has told LBC a choice between growing the economy and doing what's right for the environment is a false trade-off. Heidi Alexander has been speaking on Tonight with Andrew Marr after criticism from Sir Tony Blair about the government's net zero targets. LBC weather, a mild night with clear skies for most. Showers drifting in from the northwest in Scotland and Northern Ireland. These will become widespread in the early hours, a low of 3 degrees.
This is LBC.
Or over.
Tonight with Andrew Marr. Listen on your smart speaker. Just say, play LBC.
6:34. The victory of Mark Carney, the anti-Donald Trump Liberal leader in Canada, produced a rumbling, guttural harumph of approval in the House of Commons during Prime Minister's questions earlier today. But the lessons for British politics, if there are any, are difficult to be sure about. Yesterday, I asked whether being more aggressive to Trump might actually be good politics here at home, beyond the Liberal Democrats who already are. Lord Goodman, the Tory peer and commentator, has a slightly different view, I suspect, and he joins me now. Paul, you had a very interesting article yesterday about how to deal with Donald Trump, and you were suggesting, I think, that actually just being beastly to him might be short-term good politics, but long-term stupid politics.
My argument was our bit of Europe is substantially different from Canada, and I know Conservatives often love to draw parallels between Britain and Canada on Australia and kith and kin and all that, but I think at the moment the profile of our politics, particularly on immigration, actually is more like that of France and Germany. So although Trump, sure, he's a minus for any political party associated with him, and I'm thinking particularly of Reform, I think that will be offset when the general election comes by the concern about migration.
That's the really big issue. And of course, we've had big numbers again today. Interesting, I thought, in the House of Commons today that Kemi Badenoch was going on the grooming gangs rather than immigration or numbers coming across the channel, or indeed the net zero row inside the Labour Party.
Yes, I mean, grooming gangs, in a way, is an aspect of the whole immigration, integration, cohesion debate, of course.
It certainly is. Now, I mentioned Kemi Badenoch. She's had a tough time. You were one of the founders of Conservative Home, and in that spirit, I wonder how many Conservatives you think are going to come home on Thursday?
Well, I wasn't one of the founders. I came slightly late. But I think Kemi herself is expecting a bad result on Thursday. The last elections were fought when Boris Johnson was in the height of his pomp, if that's the right way of putting it. So Kemi Badenoch is expecting losses. The question really is what happens after that. And I just thinking back over the whole story of the last 10 years, 5 Tory leaders, 3 Labour ones, Brexit, a plague, a war, Jeremy Corbyn, the Lib Dem leader whose name I've forgotten. I mean, anything can happen in the next few years. But obviously at the moment, the story is a story of political fragmentation.
About a month ago, there was a whole set of stories suggesting that there was a plot to get rid of Kemi Badenoch and that donors and shadowy figures in the background were waiting until these elections, or failing that, early next year with the Scottish and Welsh elections for some kind of putsch. Do you think this is just wild newspaper talk, or is there something in it?
Maybe, but whoever's thinking about this just ought to look in the mirror for a moment. I mean, the Conservative Party has had 5 leaders now in 10 years. Right, we've run through 2 a year. And anyone who thinks there are easy answers or that there's some candidate on the doorstep with a miracle cure really needs their head examined.
You mentioned Reform a little bit earlier on. And of course, the thing that's going to keep people talking, I think, by the end of this week and then for months ahead is whether the Conservatives and Reform do need to have some kind of agreement. The mathematics seem logical enough, but everything else seems to me to be illogical.
You say on the present trajectory, no wonder people are talking about that. The question is whether the present trajectory will last. And as I said a moment ago, there have been so many changes in the last few years, I don't know where we're going to be by 2028.
So it's a very, very hard thing. And presumably the danger for the right of politics, if I can put it that way, is that everybody gets so obsessed about talking about structure, should there be some kind of alliance or merger or whatever it might be, that the public just gets absolutely fed up to the back teeth with it.
Yeah, and I think it's also a discussion in due course that may happen on the left, because if the trajectory continues, we're going to have 5-party politics with no one having a monopoly. And at that point, there'll be discussions about the Liberal Democrats and Labour, the Greens and Labour, the independent, so-called Gaza independents and Labour. So this may be part of a story we have to get used to. We'll see.
Well, we're all of us trying to kind of come to terms with this new world where we've got 4 parties, more or less at similar kind of levels.
Arguably 5.
Arguably 5, absolutely. It's a very, very confusing situation. Lord Goodman, Paul Goodman, thank you very, very much for coming in and trying to help me with it. So, 100 days of President Trump, and where are we? The American economy got slightly smaller in the first quarter of the year, almost certainly because of the impact of tariffs. But the president told last night's rally to ignore opinion polls, and he believes his policy will create, quotes, the greatest economy in the history of the world. I don't know about that, but he may get a significant win today if the long-awaited minerals treaty with Ukraine is, as expected, finally signed. Let's talk now to Robert Wilkie, who served as Veterans Affairs Secretary in the first Trump administration. The polling and the economy might not have been exactly what President Trump would have been hoping for today.
Well, that's the bane of almost every president. You're never as popular as you are on day one. But in terms of accomplishments, and I get back to the economy, the main issue for the president during the campaign, and is the one that came out on top in just about every pre-election poll, was immigration. Our borders were wide open. During the 4 years of Biden, the getaways that we know numbered over 15 million. And that now has stopped. And we're in the process of removing the gangs, the South American gangs in particular, that have ravaged the inner cities of our most popular urban centers. And I think you'll see on the economy, you are correct. We still have the effects of Biden inflation, but now the changes are being made to the tariff regimes. You saw that with Europe and automobiles, Canada and automobiles, and I think that will now continue. And I think the economy will bounce back.
Taking what you say on immigration, that has been a very big change. Do you think that is partly the effect of, frankly, the Trump rhetoric? In other words, there hasn't been much time to build new parts of walls or anything else. It seems to be people south of the border looking north and reading the runes.
Well, it's interesting. It's right, reading the runes. Well, interesting. It's that rhetoric, and it's also in combination with the tariff. All of a sudden, the Mexican president put 10,000 Mexican soldiers and Marines on the border, both on her southern border and then another contingent on the northern border, in response to the threat of increased tariffs and the request to stop it now in terms of the flow of people up from Central and South America. And that had a tremendous effect, where you didn't need to rapidly complete the border wall that began in the first Trump administration, and also using the emergency powers of the president. You had, soldiers of my father's old division, the 82nd Airborne Division, patrolling the border. So a combination of things happened. And it's interesting because for 4 years, President Biden said he couldn't do anything because he needed new legislation. Well, last week, the number of people who were caught coming across the border was below 50. And the president hasn't signed any new legislation. He used the powers that the president has that inherent to the office to protect the borders.
And you mentioned tariffs there. It seems almost as if the presidency is using tariffs as an all-purpose lever on all sorts of issues. But when it comes to the economy, it's only a 0.3% shrinkage, but it is significant. And a lot of people are saying this is the immediate impact of tariffs. In other words, a big surge in imports before the tariffs bite. I presume that the assumption is that in the Trump administration, that's then going to turn round. And once the tariffs are effective, you'll see a much more improved performance.
Well, I think the other component here that will trigger that performance is the unleashing of American energy. As you remember, during the first Trump administration, the price of oil per barrel was about $41. When Biden stopped the spigots, plugged them up, that price per barrel went up over 100, and that's what, essentially fueled Vladimir Putin's war machine. It got it refilled the coffers of the Ayatollahs in Tehran, and it hurt American industry, and it hurt the American economy because we were no longer exporting one thing that we have in abundance more than any other country on the planet, and that's oil, natural gas, and coal.
So that's a very big shift. Can I turn to other aspects of foreign policy, if I may? Because we hear that today the Ukrainians and the Americans may finally sign that rare earths and the minerals deal. If that happens, does that mean that for all the rhetoric, actually America is then committed to the future of Ukraine? You are, as it were, dug in. You are commercially and in terms of manufacturing and drilling inside Ukraine.
Well, that's been my argument all along. You and I grew up in an age where a couple of 100,000 American soldiers in Europe were essentially a tripwire that would engage the rest of the American military had the Soviets come across into the Fulda Gap or across the East German border. This serves a similar purpose in that it puts Americans square in the middle of the Ukrainian state. It is a tripwire that Vladimir Putin dare not cross. His experience with the first Trump administration was devastating to the point where his economy was broken. And the one time he tested the armed forces of the United States in the Syrian desert, 300 of his soldiers were killed, and there was no response from Moscow. But I do think there has been a reawakening on the part of the administration when it comes to the real nature of Vladimir Putin. He's tested the president. He's blown through every proposal that the White House has put on the table since January. And that's a pretty dangerous game for him to play. One last thing I'll say, and you've covered enough battlefields. There's a description there in the British military theory that's called the culmination point. My view is that Putin, in spite of his rhetoric, has reached the culmination point with his military. You notice there are no tanks left on the battlefield because he doesn't have any left. And the British MOD, their figures are this man has suffered 900,000 casualties and several 100,000 killed. Now, in 10 years of Vietnam, when we had 500,000 troops in Southeast Asia, we lost 56,000 troops in 10 years. Putin has blown through those numbers by an exceptional degree. And this is not the regenerative power of the Soviet Union with 300 plus millions to call on. It's essentially a third world country with nuclear weapons. And I think that's what is at play here.
That's a very salutary explanation. Do you think, alongside all of that, that frankly President Trump has now run out of patience with President Putin?
I think he has. And there's another aspect in terms of President Trump's psyche. I saw it sitting in the cabinet. He's very conscious of two words: America wins. And the last thing I know he would want to have happen is to have history say that the Trump administration lost a tussle, a fight with Vladimir Putin at the expense of Ukraine. And I think, surprisingly, that is a lesson that the KGB colonel's intelligence apparatus has, I think up to now, failed to enforce with him. That's an aspect of President Trump's diplomacy that the folks in Moscow seem to ignore.
Well, that is absolutely not the narrative we've been hearing from here up to now. So really, really important to hear it. Mr. Wilkie, thank you so much for joining LBC.
Good to see you, Andrew.
Now, coming up, we're going to get a Ukrainian perspective on that very important minerals deal, which is going to be signed tomorrow rather than today. You're listening to Tonight with Andrew Marr, and the time now is 6:47.
Coming up at 7 on LBC, Ian Dale.
Following criticism from Tony Blair and Unite, Keir Starmer and Ed Miliband are unrepentant. Are you still prepared to pay the price of the government's net zero agenda?
Ian Dale on LBC.
or over.
Tonight with Andrew Marr on LBC.
6:49. Today, the Ukrainian Prime Minister said Kyiv is indeed ready to sign that minerals deal, the one that was meant to be signed during that fateful Oval Office argument between President Zelensky and Donald Trump in February. Now, we've just spoken to Trump's former Veterans Minister. It's time now to speak to a Ukrainian voice, the chairman of Ukraine's Foreign Affairs Committee, Oleksandr Merezhko, who joins me now. Mr. Merezhko, thanks for talking to LBC. Your industry minister, I think, called this deal now a good, equal and beneficial agreement. Do you agree?
Well, I hope so, because at least from what I know, I see several wins for Ukraine. First of all, most importantly, you should understand that this is about our survival. We're trying to enhance our security. We're in difficult situation, and we need support of Mr. Trump. We need support of the United States, because without their support, without their air defense systems, missiles, there will be lots of casualties among civilian populations. And of course, we're ready to cooperate. One of the wins for Ukraine, from my perspective, is the fact that we refused to consider the previously provided by the United States military assistance to Ukraine as our debt. We're talking about creation of fund for the future. We're talking about investments in our economy, and we're talking about economic partnership on equal footing between the countries.
I'm sorry to jump in, but this is a really, really important point for people to understand. Before, President Trump was insisting that Ukraine would pay back all the aid that had been provided by the Biden administration, but he has dropped that. Is that right?
Yeah, luckily. Yeah, luckily, from what I know, it was dropped because it was a matter of principle. Otherwise, it would open Pandora box, and our European partners who had provided even more material aid, economic aid, they had the right to ask the same kind of entitlement. We couldn't afford it to happen. And like another important point, this is about our European integration. As I know, this new draft of the agreement, it doesn't hamper our joining the European Union, because we're talking about, again, common market. And, our European partners and companies, they have the right to be treated on equal footing, not to be discriminated.
Yeah. And I was just talking to Robert Wilkie, who was a minister working for Donald Trump in the first administration, still quite close to him. And he says that he thinks that having, American workers, American drilling, American companies on Ukrainian soil, not very far from the front line, is the biggest tripwire to avoid Russia coming in further. In other words, that this is a commercial deal, but deep down, it's a very important security one as well. And again, is that the view inside Ukraine?
This is exactly what I call a sort of economic security guarantee for Ukraine, because, of course, it's not 100% guarantee. The best guarantee remains to be NATO membership. But under the circumstances, to have American firms, American companies, and American economic interest in Ukraine, it creates a kind of deterrent for Putin against his new wave of aggression.
All of that sounds pretty positive and relatively optimistic. But let me put to you the other big issue here, which is the Crimea, and President Trump's insistence that Ukraine has to accept the Russians have basically got it and are going to hold on to it. Am I right in saying that it's not possible for President Zelensky to agree to that without a referendum? And you can't have a referendum while your country is at war, and therefore this is politically and constitutionally impossible for Ukraine?
Interestingly enough, even referendum will not work in this case, because in our constitution, there are absolutely no mechanisms at all which would allow to cede our territories. So constitutionally speaking, it's absolutely out of the question. Politically and morally, again, president will never agree to this. Ukrainian people will never agree to territorial concessions. We can agree.
Even if that, I'm sorry to interrupt, even if that means the war goes on and you lose even more people and possibly even more territory in the east.
But how can we do even legally if we don't have such legal mechanism? It's impossible from legal point of view, but we can agree to take back these territories, to deoccupy them later on, not necessarily by military hand, by using political and diplomatic means.
All right, Alexander, thank you very much indeed for talking to LBC tonight. It's a very important moment for your country, and our very best wishes. A Treasury committee of MPs have said today that shops may be forced to accept cash to support vulnerable people who are dependent on it. While the report stopped short of recommending an immediate change in the law, it said the government must monitor this issue. Some countries, like Australia, are already planning requirements to accept cash for essential services. Ross Borkett is the Post Office's banking director, and he joins me now. Ross, thanks for coming onto the show. In your experience in post offices up and down the country, how many, roughly what proportion of your clients are still insisting on using cash?
Hi, Andrew. Thank you for having me. Our postmasters all accept cash as part of their businesses, and the customers they're talking to really see the value in this, and we really welcome the hard work this committee has performed in really trying to dig into this issue. I think today many businesses continue to offer cash as an option for payment, but we know that overall the use of cash is declining, and I think the worry is that as that happens, we risk leaving people behind, and in particular if you think about smaller communities where there may only be a few retailers, we need to make sure we are not leaving those behind who may need access to food or medicine or fuel. And I think this report, really highlights the fact that we've got to take a really close look at this and monitor it carefully so that we don't end up sleepwalking into that situation.
I mean, this is a very fast-changing situation. It seems only yesterday I always had some coins in my pocket and some kind of crumpled banknotes in my wallet. I don't carry any cash at all now. I do everything with my phone or with a card. And I can see why so many shops feel that cash is a kind of overhead and a hassle they no longer want. Do we have any idea of how many people in this country don't have access to cards or phone banking?
So there are millions of people that still rely on cash. There are a small number who remain completely unbanked, but there are many people who much prefer or feel they just don't trust using a card or a phone for payments. And so research that's been done by Post Office and others has shown that there are still millions of people that rely on that. And so as a business, you're not going, it's pretty challenging on the high street. You're not going to want to turn customers away. You're going to want to make sure you can serve them in whichever way that customer chooses to pay. During the pandemic, we saw a lot of businesses say, actually, we're worried about using cash and stopped doing it. What we've seen since then is that really bounced back. We see many businesses see the cost of merchant fees, taking card payments as really expensive, especially small businesses. And we see lots of businesses saying, actually, we prefer to take cash because it is cheaper for us to do that. What the government did last year was to regulate access to cash. And that was really important because it means that businesses therefore can be guaranteed a place to deposit their takings at the end of the day, which is a really, really key part. And one of the things we've announced today is a renewed partnership with 30 banks and building societies of our banking framework, which means through all our post offices, you can come in and you, as a consumer or a business, can deposit or withdraw cash over our counters. And that's really key to supporting access to cash. But I think what this committee report really highlights is, whilst that is really good, we must be careful that we don't end up in a place where we then, while we can access cash, you can't spend it.
Ross Borkett, thank you very much indeed. Very lucid and useful. Thank you so much. Now, Labour has scrambled to respond to calls made by Sir Tony Blair to rethink net zero policies he says are doomed to fail. The words of the former Prime Minister have reverberated through Whitehall today. Earlier, I asked the Transport Secretary, Heidi Alexander, does Sir Tony have a point?
I think he's right to say that we need to meet people where they are at, but we also have to maintain our ambition of getting to net zero and our commitment, our legally binding commitment to get to net zero by 2050.
So that's a resounding yes. But I will be back with you tomorrow. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, where you can also pause and rewind live radio, as well as listen to a range of podcasts. Download now for free from the App Store or head to globalplayer.com. Coming up at 10 on LBC Ben Kentish. But right now it's time for Ian Dale.
Thanks, Andrew. Well, shiver me timbers. I never thought this could happen, but Tony Blair, Unite the Union, Nigel Farage and a good chunk of the Conservative Party are united on one thing. What is it, I hear you ask? That the government has gone too far on net zero and that it's wrong to ask people to pay for measures which will have scant little effect on global warming. The Prime Minister and Ed Miliband are unrepentant. Are you still prepared to pay the price of the government's net zero agenda? On Cross Question at 8, Labour MP Preet Kaur Gill, former Conservative Chairman Greg Hands, former Gogglebox star Josh Tapper and political commentator Dr Tim Hames. At 9, has what happened in Spain and Portugal this week made you think about doomsday scenarios?
On your radio, on Global Player.